It's really my great pleasure to introduce to you someone you all know of, and many of you have met, Dr. William Bennett. You all know his pedigree, and yesterday at his very well-attended public lecture, Dean Randy Deal went through it in a great deal of detail. I'll only hit a few highlights, my favorite highlights, which don't include his time as Secretary of Education and doesn't include his time as drug czar. The highlight for me is as a young child watching, I think it was Nightline or one of the TV news shows, and seeing Dr. Bennett repeatedly talk about the importance of virtue and character in American society. And I remember how refreshing it was. I can't remember what he said, but I remember how refreshing it was that there was someone talking about the importance of those issues in the context of politics, not simply in a philosophy class or in a discussion of philosophy, but in a discussion of politics. And of course, his book of virtues, which I read and have a copy of at home still, was a national bestseller for how many weeks, Bill?
About 88.
88 weeks. So that's 88 weeks longer than my books were bestsellers. And it really was for me, as a very young person, younger than almost anyone in this room at that time, it was really not simply refreshing, it was inspiring to see someone talking about ethics and character and doing it in a way that was substantive, that pointed to real stories, real experiences, real narratives. And I think that's remained with me for a long time. So when I think of Dr. Bennett, I don't think of his government jobs. I think of him as one of our tribe of PhDs who are working hard to bring knowledge and research to practical policy application in the world. That's why I think we're here at the LBJ School. That's certainly why I'm here. And I'm inspired to be able to sit next to someone who's played such a heroic role in these activities. Yesterday, Dr. Bennett talked in great detail about research on education, especially K through 12 education, and put out a number of propositions which we discussed and chewed on in the lecture, I think in a very productive way. Today he's going to focus, I've asked him to focus more on the issue of ethics and politics, though I think he's happy to answer questions on education, of course, as well, sure. And these things overlap. The three big questions I've asked him to focus on, but he will, of course, do whatever he wishes, but the three big questions I've asked him to focus on are, first, what role do ethics play in our politics today? An empirical question. How do we understand the role of ethics in politics today? We are bombarded with evidence of the absence of ethics in politics. What role do ethics play in politics today? Second question, what role should they play? And I mean should not in an ontological way, but actually in a very teleological way. What role is it possible they could play that they're not playing? Right? And then third, and most specific for us here, what can we do in this room to help push that agenda forward? Which is to say, what can we do to make a productive discussion of ethics more a part of our productive discussion of politics? As I've told Bill a few times, I'm particularly interested in this because I'm convinced that at the LBJ school and at all other policy schools, we're not doing a good enough job of teaching ethics. My friend Mike Granoff will probably say the same about the business school, I would think. What should we be doing? How can we make sure the future leaders who are sitting here are prepared for the ethical questions and the ethical leadership that they want? And how can we as professors and students do a better job of preparing ourselves? So those are the issues I put on the table. I'm sure we'll go well beyond those. And I'll just turn it over to you, Bill, to start us off.
Thank you, Jeremy. Everybody, good afternoon. Great to be here. Great to be back at the University of Texas. May you have a football team worthy of your academic programs one of these days.
Tell DeLoss you said that.
It was uneven. Was Manziel actually wanting to go to the University of Texas, or is that true?
Yes, he did.
Oh, for Pete's sakes. You know, Brands is a great historian, but you might consider a trade for Brands for Manziel. Tells you where my ethics are, huh? I liked everything he said except teleological. Do we have to talk like that?
No.
Okay. I can do that. I did my PhD in philosophy here at the University of Texas. I can do that epistemological stuff if you want to do that. No. Thank you. This is a whirling dervish of a guy, as you know. He knows all of you. He loves all of you. He's all over the place. He does a zillion things. and Energizer Rabbit, Energizer Bunny, amazing, Jeremi Suri. And I insulted him all month by talking to him and addressing him as Dean Suri, and he had to correct me. He said, I'm Professor Suri. I said, sorry, you got to remember academic hierarchies, right? I mentioned this yesterday in the speech when Daniel Patrick Moynihan was running for re-election in New York. He was running against Jim Buckley, Bill Buckley's brother, and they had their first debate. And Bill Buckley, conservative, referred to Senator Moynihan as Professor Moynihan. And Moynihan responded, the mudslinging starts early. So I'll just call you Jeremi.
Thank you.
It's a great topic. We've got till 1:30. I don't want to be long-winded, and I'd love to just have a good conversation with you. Ethics is a great topic. It's also a risky topic. Thank you for mentioning the Book of Virtues. It was very successful. A couple of interesting stories about it, which might put discussions of ethics and virtue in some perspective for our talk today. First of all, thanks for the compliment. It was successful, and it sold a lot of books, but there's always somebody else, My book sold a lot more than your book, more weeks on the bestseller list. My book is to your book like J.K. Rowling's book is to my book. Okay? I sold 2 million copies of the Book of Virtues in 2.5 years.
Wow,
that's a lot.
That's a lot of books.
J.K. Rowling sold 45 million copies of her last book in about 2 days. And so there, That's my brother.
Why don't we bring her?
Yeah, well, yeah, her. The fee schedule is different, I think. But well, you got a generous guy, though. You got a generous guy, John. Anyway, that's one thing. Second thing, I had a hard time getting it published. Now, this might tell you something. Yeah, I had this manuscript. The reason I wrote the book, and this will maybe be interesting to you, is my wife, Mrs. Bennett here, Elaine Bennett. When I became Secretary of Education, Elaine said, "Don't just stand there and make pronouncements about education. You're in the cabinet. Don't just make pronouncements. Find out what you're talking about first." And I said, "Why should I be different from the other guys?" And it's a joke, that's right. And she said, "Because you're the Secretary of Education, go do your homework." I said, "What do you want me to do?" She said, "Go to school, go teach classes, elementary, middle school, high school. Find out what's going on. Talk to parents, talk to kids, talk to teachers, watch classes, then make your pronouncements." I said, "Elaine, I am the Secretary of Education of the United States. I do wholesale. I don't do retail policy." See, I'm just going to sit above the fray and Elaine, who's the daughter of a successful businessman, said, "Do good retail and you'll do better wholesale." So off I went, backpack in hand, books in hand, to teach classes around the country. A lot of funny stories, a lot of great experiences. But I learned a lot about American education. At several junctures, people said to me, I saw on your resume that you have a PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas, and you studied moral philosophy, political philosophy with John Silber, ethics with Edmund Pinkoffs, and other people. Can you help us on the ethics and values questions? And I said, "Well, I don't know. What kind of help do you need?" "Well, we'd like to know what to say to our kids about right and wrong and ethics and virtue." And the problem is, and I heard this once, I heard 1,000 times, our problem is our kids come from all sorts of different places and all sorts of different backgrounds. Is there anything we can say to them in common? So I thought about this, and as I heard the question more often, I engaged a lot of people in conversation about it, some of my teachers and others. And then I just thought about it in a commonsensical way, and so I started to ask the teachers back, do you have kids who like to be bullied? Do you have kids from cultures where you enjoy being bullied? Do you have kids where the girls like to be grabbed by boys against their will? Do you have kids who like to be pushed down the stairs or made fun of by other kids? No. The answer is always no. I said, well, it's kind of interesting about human beings. I said, I do believe from my study of philosophy that there are a rough set of principles that are pretty well shared among a variety of cultures. Of course there are cultural differences. Of course there are. But there are things that most human beings have in common, and there are things that are valued culture to culture. And I think they are the virtues, things like compassion and courage and justice and honesty. And I went through a list, at least the beginning of a list, which became the list, which was the book. I then had this idea of the Book of Virtues, and I peddled it around to publishers. It was 1993 when the book finally came out. I had been Secretary of Education, and I had been the drug czar, ridiculous title, Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. That's why they called me drug czar. Only funny thing about that title, I could refer to my wife as Zarling, and our then two little boys as the Sardines. And I was one of these guys with the 24-hour security protection. You know, wherever we went, we had the security protection. I'd go get a Slurpee for my son John at 7-Eleven, and we would have a chase car and a follow car and a this and a siren, and sometimes it was just too much trouble. But there were threats, and there were the more successful we were, and these are interesting policy questions, which I'd like to explore with this distinguished policy group. The more successful we are, the more threats we got. Kind of an interesting disincentive process, right? And the more you go after the drug guys, the more threats you get, and the less likely you are to visit Mexico, boss. You know, sorry, they still got my picture up. In fact, when I saw my picture here on campus, I wanted to be sure it didn't say wanted for crimes against the people. The familia. Anyway, we did a good job. We can talk about that if you want. But I put forward this proposal about a book of virtues, 10 virtues, readings from a variety of cultures. And we had a whole variety of cultures. And couldn't find a publisher. One publisher said, you got all these stories about virtues and right and wrong. You don't have any pictures. You don't have any very contemporary stuff. Who would buy this book? I said, oh, well, maybe these teachers would. So I put the material together and just sent it out to the teachers who had asked me. And they wrote back and said it was good. So finally I did get a publisher. I got no advance. And there it was, and it was out there in 1993, and it sold very well. That's one story about the Book of Virtues. The other story about the Book of Virtues is if you do that and you have any kind of prominence at all, and I had a little bit of prominence as Secretary of Education and as the first drug czar. By the way, my elevation to drug czar, my confirmation was engineered by Joe Biden, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he and I had a lot of conversations, still talk, because I was the first, and so it was, what am I about? What am I after? Am I going after underage drinking? No, you're not. You're going after cocaine. You're going after heroin. Anyway, so the book came out. I finally found this publisher, and the book came out. One of the other difficulties with writing a book of virtues is that if you have any kind of prominence or name, people think that when you put out a book with a name like that you think you're better than other people. The virtues are, what? Bill Bennett is telling us all how to live. I was answering the teacher's question. So it became a kind of easy target. Some people were really offended by it, as if I knew better, and as if by publication of that book, I was telling people, I'm a good guy, I've got virtue, and you don't, you dope, and you need to read my book. I wasn't making any such claim. In fact, in the introduction, I said this book was written out of weakness, not out of strength. And in fact, I started where I thought, I listed the virtues roughly in the order in which I thought I needed them. And so it was to me an act of, I thought, intellectual humility, not arrogance. But that's not the way it's taken. That's not the way it was taken. Now, this is interesting because this is a country that really does take ethics and morality seriously. Jeremi can tell you, you probably do it in your courses. When Bryce comes to America, when Tocqueville comes to America, when any of these smart foreigners come to America to write about us in the 19th century, 18th century, one thing they notice is this moral squint. Americans like to talk about this in terms of right and wrong. As Tocqueville said, our music is better, our food is better in France, our art is better, but I think those Americans are better. they measure things. The belief that moral values should be taught to young people is as old as the Republic itself. You read Jefferson's Rockfish Gap State Report, read Franklin, read the Federalist Papers, where Madison says the best work on public policy ever written, American public policy, where Madison says all of these things, separation of powers, all auxiliary safeguards. The fundamental safeguard is a sense of right and wrong, a sense of virtue in the American people, sense of virtue. They use the word virtue in the American people. But if you're there in Washington, you put out a book like this, people take it, again, somewhat as you're saying, you're better than her. That it's comical moments too. I remember I was at the Palm restaurant, a rare occasion for me. It's a big beef restaurant. That's a joke too. Okay. We were at Vince Young's last night, thanks to you. What a modest statement that is of kind of Texas values. As you walk in the door, there's about a 9 trillion pound steer. Is that what it is? Longhorn. And a 400-foot picture of Vince, having won the game. And my friend said, subtle, nice touch, gentle touch here in Texas. Anyway, it's a fabulous game, it was a fabulous night. Anyway, I was at the Palm restaurant, and the book had been out about 6 months. And I was drinking a martini and eating steak. And this guy came by and said, is that virtuous? First comment you want to say is, give me a break, But I said, yes, if it's perfectly mixed and perfectly grilled, it is. So you got to put up with that. Fast forward, Larry King. You guys know who Larry King is. He just went off TV and radio. We're on a plane together, and he said, you're all grown up, so you'll excuse part of the story. He said, this is about 20 years ago. He said, you should run for president. I said, I should? Why? He said, you're a good guy. You're a good Republican. You're a reasonable Republican. I said, that means a lot coming from you, Larry. I know you think those two things run together, but I appreciate it. He said, tell me something. I said, you ever slept with a boy? I said, no. He said, you ever left the scene of a crime? No. You ever hit anybody with your car? I said, no. He said, then you should run. I said, is that it? Is that it? Is that? Well, now fast forward to George W. Bush about, 1999, so 14 years ago, about 8 blocks from here. And he's got a search committee that Cheney is chairing for vice president. And he turns to me after having breakfast, Governor Bush. He says, what about you? I said, what about me? What, sir? And he said, what about you? You want to consider this? Because I'd been talking to him about some other issues. And I said, no, thank you. Very nice of you to think of me, but no, thank you. And I'll finish the story in a second. This was actually the second time that someone had asked me. Bob Dole had asked me in 1996. You didn't know this, did you?
I did not know that.
I got something he doesn't know. When you get something he doesn't know, make sure it counts.
I want documentation now.
I got you. It's written down. It's documented. Newsweek did it, and Joe Klein, other people did. Bob Dole, I'd written a speech for Bob Dole, I helped write a speech for Bob Dole. He gave in Hollywood, and we were in his car that morning, and he said, I said, who are you thinking of for vice president? He said, I don't know. A lot of dumb people out there. I said, who do you think I should have? I said, Kemp. And he said, nah, I'm not going to pick Kemp. I was like, those ideas are crazy. He ended up picking Kemp. I said, who are you thinking of? He said, what about you? I said, me? Why me? He said, Eastern, Catholic, intellectual, independent. I said, I'm so touched, it's so personal. Check, And I said, no, I just never thought of myself that way. I've never run for office. I've never, been active in politics. I've been engaged in commentary about politics. I'm interested in policy, like a lot of you guys. So when George W. Bush asked me this, I'd had some experience with the question. And I'd also had some vetting on this with some friends. And I said, no, I can't do it. He said, why? And I said, because of the Book of Virtues. He said, what do you mean? The Book of Virtues was great. I said, raise the bar for me. I said, if I hadn't written the Book of Virtues, I said, I'm going to be held to some standard of moral excellence that I can't reach. He said, well, what do you mean? He didn't then ask me Larry King type question. He said, you've done something horrible? I said, no, I haven't done anything horrible. I said, here it is, Governor. I was a bachelor till I was 38. So there's a great country song called Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. And that was part of my life. Nothing horrible, but, nothing that would embarrass a person who hadn't written the Book of Virtues. But if you've written the Book of Virtues, people are going to say, aha, this guy was hanging around bars. This guy was going this place and that place. My wife's here. I've got to be careful. 31 years of clean living since Mrs. Bennett said yes. Anyway, just a kind of normal bachelor life with a fair amount of looking for love in all the wrong places. And so I said, I think that cuts me out. I talked to a few friends about it, and they said, yeah, it does. Because the funny ambivalence about Americans is we take our morality and our ethics very seriously. We also are very sensitive to people whom it looks like or sounds like they're lording their ethics and morality over us, telling us they're better. And boy, if you are interpreted as a person who's doing that, you better be clean as a whistle. And I was an average guy. I wasn't clean as a whistle. And so I figured on those grounds. Plus, really frankly, not wanting to do it, not wanting to campaign for that long period of time, that was the right thing to do. And I want to come back to this point, and I want to shut up, which is we are, I think, in terms of our perspective on things like policy, traditionally about the most moral-minded people in the world. We can disagree on what the moral thing to do is, but we do view things through a moral lens in a way that very few other countries, peoples do. I'm not saying we're the only ones. There are others who do, and some of it differs. But it's part of who we are. I think it's in the DNA of Americans. The other thing is one has to approach it carefully and thoughtfully, so as to not appear to be lording it over other people or saying you know better. The third thing is that I would mention, and this for discussion, I think appropriate to a classroom, particularly graduate school students in public policy. There are tremendous confusions about ethics in most academic discussions. And the most important confusion stems from thinking of ethics or morality as a series of dilemmas or problems that have to be addressed. Go to a lot of ethics courses at universities, and you will have a series of puzzles or problems. You're on a raft, and it only has room for 7 people, and there are 8. Who goes off? And then you have some clever professor saying, well, there's a professor, there's a lawyer, off, and so on. Terry Schiavo, do you pull the plug on Terry Schiavo? The great dilemmas. Truman, Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. I think, as I have studied it, as I learned it here, as I have read it, this is not the right way to think about morality and ethics for the most part. Yes, those may be interesting questions, and you can test your wares on it, and you can have interesting discussions. And the question about Harry Truman is a good question for historians to ask and philosophers to ask and us to ask. But I believe, from my study and my experience in life, the main point of ethics is about one's normal, everyday life, which is not about dilemmas, which is not about searing and difficult intellectual questions, but about a certain regularity, a certain kind of normalcy, a certain willingness to work hard, observe the rules, and live honorably. At the first commencement at the College of New Jersey, John Witherspoon said to James Madison and the class, here's all I can tell you, boys, that matters. Live well, do not be dishonorable, and die in peace. The notion that one conducts one's life in a way that is free from the kind of burdens that terrible decisions, bad choices, consorting with the wrong people, doing evil in the world can burden you down with. Point, Aristotle, still the best public policy guy, I think, after the founders. I actually think he's not as good as the founders. But he says, because man is a political animal, lives in the polis, because he takes an interest in right and wrong and good and evil, he creates two institutions, the polis and the family, because he is a creature who believes in right and wrong and good and evil. That's, I think, where one should start in talking about ethics. Not in the searing dilemmas of the time, but in the person you know, and you all know someone, who doesn't sit around puzzled, scratch his head, and wonder about the great moral dilemmas of the time, but who's someone you can count on, someone you can call on. When you call on that person, there's always somebody home, and that's a reliable person. You think of the people with whom you would trust your children, or the person you would trust to drive your wife across the country, something like that. And that, I think, gets much closer to how we should start talking about ethics and think about character and ethics rather than the searing dilemmas. Are there ethical dilemmas in public life? Sure. And I gave Jeremi a title for this, which is, are there ethical people in Washington politics? Of course there are. Many of them are. I've worked in the academy, I've worked in politics, I've worked in business, and I will tell you the percentage of people who I think fit what I'm just describing, about the same among the various professions. Maybe a little less in the academy if they do it for a living. That is, if they do moral philosophy for a living. I don't know what it is about doing moral philosophy for a living, but I overall trust the engineers more often. It's a little bit like psychiatrists, half of whom I think are crazy. I think if you hang around this stuff too long and dwell on it too long, it starts to get to you. That's just a personal impression. I have no data for this. It's just my own sense. I remember being at University of Wisconsin, where you were, my last story, and there was a seminar in advanced ethics going on in the evenings when I was writing some articles. And in Wisconsin, as you know, the vending machines, the robot machines, all have milk in them. Some of them have soft drinks, milk. It's a big product. They have cheese, they have milk, they have Packers stuff. No, anyway, they went in there on the break, the advanced ethics seminar. I will never forget this. And somebody put in a quarter and all hell broke loose. The machine broke, and it was just throwing out milk cartons and stuff right and left. And the professor said, grab as many as you can. I said, wait a minute. What is this seminar? He said, advanced ethics. I said, oh, so you don't do the mundane stuff like not stealing from the guy who has to empty the vending machine. He said, he didn't know what I was talking about. He said, this is a freebie, the system. The system is broken down. We can get some revenge on the system. I said, you're getting revenge on the guy who has to turn in the thing, you know. So that may give rise to my notion about moral philosophers. Love moral philosophy, read moral philosophy, be careful of moral philosophers. And you see, I'm suggesting the same suspicion and worry that people suggested about me when I put the book in. You got to be careful in America with this stuff.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful way to start. I'll just put one question on the table, and then I'm going to turn it over to others. I'll just play traffic cop. Why does it seem that it's so hard to get ethical people in positions of leadership? Why do we see so many examples, not just of people being normal, but of people doing things that seem so ethically difficult to justify in their daily behavior in positions of power? Is that a problem, or is it just that we see more of it today than before?
I don't know what you're talking about.
So, for instance, when we have
generals, heads of corporations, people in politics.
Yeah.
I think I know a lot of them. You know, some of them aren't exemplars, but you know, some are. Many are. Compared to where? Compared to what? Deans, professors, football players. Who? What? I mean, I don't mean to be facile with you, but you know, they're good. There's good and bad. There are people who have a lot of sins and errors and mistakes. But you know, I've lived in Washington for 35 years, and we know people of honor on both sides of the aisle. It's not an oversupply, but I'm not sure it's an oversupply anywhere. Maybe at a monastery, but maybe not. I don't know. I'm a Catholic. I thought the Catholic Church had a pretty good premium on this stuff, but maybe not. We went through that. I had to write as the author of the Book of Virtues. They hounded me until I did an editorial in the Journal in 2002 or 3, in which it was very hard for me to do. I urged my good friend, Bernard Cardinal Law, to resign because he was in the business of taking these priests who were doing these absolutely odious things and not canning them or firing them, but moving them from one place to another. But, I mean, I may be more forgiving than you. I believe in original sin. You may not. I don't know. I think we're born flawed. And I think it's remarkable when people achieve a certain level of decency and decent behavior, despite, a whole lot of possibilities and temptations the other way.
It just seems that there was more decent behavior in Washington 20 years ago, but that might be wrong.
I don't believe that. I mean, I hear this all the time in the news. I mean, these guys don't get together and have drinks together anymore. Well, who cares? I mean, who cares if they have drinks? I mean, and the public rancor is, I think, more intense. I agree with you on that. But you know your history. I mean, politics in the 18th century. They had little statues of Washington with guillotines attached. John Jay, what's the chant about John Jay? Damn John Jay. Damn all those who love John Jay. Damn all those who won't damn John Jay. Lincoln was an ape. Lincoln was a this, a that. Politics has been hardball in American life for a long time. The Jackson candidacy, Andrew Jackson. I mean, this it's brutal stuff. I mean, before the Civil War, they said we better adopt a rule. They think of the gun debate now. They adopt a rule about no guns should be brought into the Senate during debate. You had the guy from South Carolina trying to beat the guy from Massachusetts with his cane. He beat him to death. Somebody wrote, one commentator said everybody's got either a knife or a gun. It's America, kind of a wide open place. So I'm struck by the fact that even in Washington, there are people who are worth being with and who can emulate, and you can even point to your kids and say, there's a good person, there's a good man. I had to worry. And when I came to Washington as a pretty young guy, 38, in public policy, and I was interested in philosophy and public policy, I remember visiting with a guy named Jacob Javits. You remember Jacob Javits, senator from New York, a liberal Republican senator from New York. We don't do that anymore in the Republican Party. It's like a conservative Democrat senator from Massachusetts. We don't do that in the Democrat Party anymore. And Jacob Javits came to the National Humanities Center where I was working. And I said, I'm getting this job as chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He said, oh, how'd you get that? And I said, half joking, I said, well, the Reagan administration had a search for a chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And they looked for a professor of the humanities who had voted for Ronald Reagan. And there were 3 of us.
And many.
In the country. And I was the second choice. The first guy was from Texas and University of Dallas. And he came up, and before he was confirmed, before he made the rounds and shook hands with the senators, he gave a speech denouncing Lincoln, Not smart. I mean, as a Republican, we don't have that many superstars, but we do have a couple, and he's one. The movie points out he's a Republican. I said that when that movie comes out, they're going to make him a Democrat. I know that they are, but they did. They were honest. They did.
Absolutely,
okay,
absolutely.
A couple of times.
Yeah, different Republican Party, but
yeah, I understand. Foundation of the Republican Party. Anyway, so he didn't get the job. So they asked me if I wanted it, and I said sure. So I said just keep your mouth shut until you're confirmed. And I went around the Senate doing the courtesy call, shaking hands. I remember going to Senator Quayle's office, and we had chit-chat. And as I left, Senator Quayle said, oh, Bennett. Lincoln. I said, I'm totally cool on Lincoln. Love the guy. Love the guy. But okay. So anyway, that was my job. So when I talked to Javits, I said, I'm going up there, and I said, it's basically a grant-making organization. It gives grants to scholars and to research projects and to TV shows on the humanities, history, philosophy, literature. And I said, I have a simple question, Senator Javits. I said, I've heard all this about Washington. I said, do I have to lose my soul? When I go to Washington, do I have to lose my soul? He said, no. He said, just be careful who you dance with. I said, what do you mean? He said, if you dance with one team, you're going to have to dance with the other team. If you get, if you yield to pressure from somebody, they're going to know you yield to pressure, and they're going to want to know why you don't yield the next time. It was kind of like that conversation Thomas More has with Roper and Richard Rich in A Man for All Seasons, which is one of the great ethics plays. Absolutely. And I remember Lane and I were on our honeymoon. You remember this, in North Carolina. And at 2 in the morning, there's a knock on the door, and I said, my gosh, I'm from New York, North Carolina. Here we are on our honeymoon. Is this against the law in North Carolina? It's a joke. All right, never mind. Because you couldn't drink in you couldn't order a drink in North Carolina. Then I thought maybe you can't sleep with your wife either. Anyway. But there was a loud knock on the door, and it was our honeymoon. We didn't have much money, so we rented a beach cottage for a couple of nights. And there's a state trooper, North Carolina state trooper. So are you Mr. Bennett? And I said, yeah, Senator Bennett. And I said, well, good enough, Chairman Bennett. He said, well, you have an urgent phone call from Washington. It's this congressman from Pennsylvania saying, have you taken office yet? I said, next week. He said, there's a grant from my district. I want to make damn sure that they get their money. And I thought, boy, oh boy, this is what Javits was talking about. And, Javits, I got back, and the first thing I did was, turn it down. Without reading it, I just wanted to sort of establish myself. I'm turning that thing down. I'm not yielding to this pressure. But you know what? You know what I learned? Not only does the story that if you yield get around, but if you don't yield, that gets around too. So after a while, people said, and this I was proud of, hey, I understand, Mr. Chairman, that you don't take in treaties, you don't like to be pushed around on this stuff. I just want you to look at the proposal. Yes, Senator, we'll give it a good, careful look. And you know what? It worked for a long time. And it worked when I was Secretary of Education. It worked when I was drug czar. Because in all those jobs, those of you who may go into government, basically what you realize people are coming to you for is not advice or judgment or counsel or recommendations. They're coming from money. And it's bothered me when I was Secretary of Education. I thought people would be interested in my theories about educational practice. In fact, they were interested in my money, and that was all. Not my money, your money. But yes, I think you can keep your integrity intact. I mean, I have people I very much admired, whom I've met in Washington, people with whom I've disagreed, had mighty debates with, but they're there.
That's refreshing and helpful to hear.
Yep.
I promised we'd start with some undergraduate questions. I've seen a number of other hands. I will get to my colleagues, but before I get to my faculty colleagues, I want to allow some undergraduates to get in. Joshua?
First, Dr. Bennett, thanks very much for being here.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask you about 2 cases going through the federal benches that speak to your both academic and government service experience. The first is Diaz versus USA. It's a case going through the Eastern District Court of New York. And the question here is around mandatory minimum sentencing for drug sales. The person involved was distributing heroin, low-level sort of drug dealer, and the mandatory minimum sentence is 10 years. The judge there has said that the original laws around mandatory minimums were not designed to punish folks in this sort of way, but were to go after the bigger fish. And there's also been recent scholarship from Michelle Alexander, for example, up in Ohio State, saying that mandatory minimums and other drug policies are creating what she calls the new Jim Crow, subjugating especially black and brown people to a system that she deems more destructive than slavery is. And the second case I wanted to get your opinion about is Fisher versus the University of Texas. Something very intimate that we have here. And your experience, I think, with as Secretary of Education offers a unique perspective on this.
Yeah. Well, easy ones, huh?
Yeah.
Why don't we go to the faculty?
Yes.
I need to know more of the facts in the first case, and some of what I'm saying here may be dated. But one of the reasons that there was pressure for the mandatory minimums was that a lot of judges were ignoring the law and not giving sentences at all. there were, even from the earliest days, sentiments from the bench about legalization, and that we shouldn't be enforcing this, that this was the new prohibition, and so on. And things, in some ways, have gotten looser since then. You've got Colorado and Washington State now. In my experience as drug czar, the fiercest people for sentencing, the people who most wanted to throw the book at the drug dealers, were the people in the most affected communities. That is, in what you just cited, the black and brown communities. I remember going to Boston. I did the drug czar job, same way I did the education job. I went to about 140 places, and we went where the problem was worst. We went to the south end of Boston. I remember when I got there, I was met by quite a retinue of Democrats, Senator Kennedy, Governor Dukakis, Senator Kerry. And we went into a school, and we were talking to the kids in the school, and I was carrying on a dialogue with the kids and asked them what we should do about drug policy, and the kids were very tough. Now, they lived in a tough neighborhood with a lot of drugs. Then we went out into the community. The toughest part, where cops told us there was the most offenses, the most crack houses. And the complaint I got from the community when I said, I was there 2-3 hours, was, why can't you lock these guys up? Why can't you keep these guys off the street? They're not in your neighborhood, Mr. Bennett. They're in our neighborhood. Why can't you lock them up? That night I went to Harvard and gave a lecture, and the only question I had all night was drug legalization. I said, I have never heard anybody in Roxbury or in Anacostia push me on legalization. I hear this at the university. I hear it sometimes in political forums. I never hear it from the people who are getting their brains beat out. So I understand some of the arguments against the mandatory minimum, and I hate taking away discretion from judges. But one of the reasons that was done was people felt the discretion was being abused. On Fisher, that's very complicated, and I haven't read the briefs. I mean, I know the case, and I know what it's about, and I wrote a book years ago called Counting by Race. And this goes back to my work in elementary and secondary education. I won't be too long-winded here. But I believe that we are continuing to make excuses for what Bill Raspberry used to call the soft bigotry of low expectations that was picked up by George W. Bush. But he said, why do we keep shunting our kids, our minority kids, off into slower tracks and lower tracks? Let's get this thing right from an early age. We had a question yesterday, but supposing it takes longer for kids who don't come from advantage, who don't have two parents, who don't have all sorts of things, then take longer. If I didn't think that black and brown children couldn't achieve at the same level that white children, even privileged white children, can, I wouldn't be saying this. But I went to the schools, I went to communities, and I saw it with my own eyes. And when I saw Jaime Escalante or Joe Clark or any of these miraculous people who turned schools around, it reaffirmed my notion. And I don't like the tinkering stuff. Set whatever standards you want that are reasonable for academic performance and academic promise, and stick to it. I think it was wrong to discriminate against people because they are one race or another, and I still think it's wrong. It was wrong when you did it one way, it's wrong when you do it the other way. And I know which way history has gone here. I know the weight of history. But I don't think we're going to get this right until we get it right. And as Hubert Humphrey said, someone I much admired during the whole debate on the Civil Rights Act, we will never use this to discriminate against people of any color or race. Does that mean over the short run you might have fewer minorities on some campuses? Yep, it might. But I think in the long run it's the only way through. That's my view.
So let's do another student question, then we'll go to the easier faculty and graduate student questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read up on Fisher because I have two friends who've written briefs on opposite sides of this.
I just wanted to reiterate what my friend Josh has already said. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
Today. This goes back to when you said you were receiving threats.
Death threats.
During your position.
Oh, these were death threats. No, the cartel doesn't say we're going to, we're going to put toilet paper on your trees.
That's a different cartel.
Yeah, that's very good. Very good. No, these are death threats. Yeah.
So this begs the question that outside influences, do they really have a big effect on the way that people are ethical when they're doing their job, the way that they do their job, the decisions that they make, whether it is an appointed position or an elected position, whether they're focusing on raising money, like you said, it's so hard to get, or whether it's just personal religion that is affecting these outside influences, having an effect on the way they're doing their job. Did this influence you in any way? Do you see a lot of this going on in Washington?
Do you mean something like the death threat affecting your judgment?
Outside influences affecting your morals, your values. If your children are in danger, are you going to be doing your job differently than if it's someone else's
I'm
children?
confident you can come up with a scenario, the gun at the head of your child, or something that could affect me, anybody. But what you just described didn't do anything except make me madder about this. But that's not necessarily virtue of character. That just could be disposition. A friend of mine said to me, "I've been watching you for years." He said, "I hadn't seen this guy since college." He said, you remind me of the Irishman who walks down the street. He sees a fight going on. He says, "Is this a private fight or can anybody get in on it?" And there are people who are like that. Moynihan, the guy I'll mention again, was like that. And he wanted to get on any fight. And he was great at it. And with 2 or 3 drinks, he was even better. And that's a gift some of the Irish have. Excuse me, I'm stereotyping. I know them. Anyway, I've lived with them. Pressures, external pressures, sure. I think George Eliot said, we are more than the sum of the external influences on us, but the external influences on us matter. And for me, when I did the drug czar job, more so than the education job, I was fact-finding, because I didn't know a lot about drugs, except for being on a university campus all of 1965 to 1975, so I was no doubt subject to tons of, passive inhalation. When I got to the Harvard Yard Law School, it was a fog. It was just a fog, and that was 68. But sure, I'm not answering your question.
I was just kind of going on how do you balance this when you have these external influences?
I'll give you an example.
Go ahead.
Lobbyists, polls, trading votes. You may not believe in one thing to get the other vote in return. That's very common to be poll-driven rather than what you believe in. It's very common to trade something, a vote for an expense and something you don't believe in to get the vote in return. And it's causing troubles at the top financially.
You want to tell folks who this is?
This is actually Scott Noble, who's been our generous sponsor for bringing Dr. Bennett here. So thank you for doing that, but thank you also for a great question and holding him to the fire on that too. So.
Well, I think, does this happen? Well, of course it happens. Some people say, well, how's it poll? There was that famous story Dick Morris said, told about how trivial it was at one point in the Clinton administration. So, well, should we go surf, the beach, or should we go backpacking? What poll's better? Come on, go where you want to go, for Pete's sake. But other people may change their vote because of the poll. And is that low-down behavior? It might be. It also might be, I need to get reelected in order to advance the cause that I'm trying to advance. It's the great example of Senator Fulbright, J.W. Fulbright, whom the Fulbright Scholar Program is named in Arkansas, who consistently voted wrong on civil rights. So he would stay elected in Arkansas so he could be a force for, as his supporters thought, reason when it came to the war in Vietnam. And he wrote about this in his memoirs. He said, I believed in the cause of civil rights, but I knew a strong statement in support of it would kill me politically, and I thought it was critical that I, as one of the few critics of the war in Vietnam, stay in the Senate. I don't agree with him on either, by the way, but that doesn't matter. You can look at what the person's doing and how they're weighing it, but there might be a good reason to weigh it. There might be a good reason to defer. You have to look at the man and a woman and the totality of their actions. You have to look at the whole context. As a generalization, I think, what Scott said is right. A friend of mine was thinking about running for office, and he had 3 of the most prominent pollsters out to dinner. And he said, I just want to see what you guys think. I know what I think, but I want to see what you guys think. And one guy's, Mike Murphy, you see him on TV, pollster, said, well, the one great virtue you have is we don't have to tell you what to believe. It's a funny locution, isn't it? You don't have to tell you what to believe. You know what you believe. And as long as you stick to that and are faithful to that, you'll be fine. There are people who make it up as they go along, and there are people who are entirely poll-driven, and there are people like that on both sides of the aisle. But if anything, right now, I think there's there's more reluctance to be sort of driven by some of those factors than people's own ideology that they bring with them. These are certainly ideological times.
Right. What about lobbyists that Scott also mentioned?
Lobbyists have influence, of course they do. Aristotle says power is the ability to be or to make things be. And people talk to the money people and they are affected by it. But there are money people and there are money people. There's money people often on both sides of an issue. People can find their way to the decision that they want to make often and be subject to the, and please one lobbyist but not another. Are there people there who are just pawns of the greatest influences, financial or otherwise? Yes. I think they're in a minority. If I think about the people I disagree with, in some ways the most, some of the liberal Democrats, because of my politics, I don't accuse them of being financially corrupt. I think they're wrong. I just think they're ideologically wrong, like they think I'm ideologically wrong. But we differ on that. I don't call them knaves. I may call them other things, dopes, but like surely what they call me, but or worse. But I don't think they've been bought.
So
Bernie Sanders from Vermont, he's not bought. He's a socialist. Better to be bought. People who've been bought have not done gulags for the most part.
I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that part, and I'm going to go to
No, the gulags are bad.
Professor Carolyn Heinrich.
So first of all, let me just start this my question for you by saying your book of virtues came out shortly after our first child was born. It's been on our fireplace mantle ever since. It's a wonderful book. But the question I have for you is, so in public management research, and academic area of research, there's a couple of theories. One's called public service motivation, another organizational stewardship. And basically they've now, empirical research has now confirmed that if you look across people who are in government organizations, nonprofits, or for example, private organizations, we do see people more public service oriented, motivated, as well as in organizational stewardship, it's someone who puts the good organization ahead of their private interests. So that's the theory. One of the things we've seen in education increasingly, and this was actually part of No Child Behind, one of the ways we're trying to address the gaps in students' achievement is, for example, when schools aren't performing, we open up to the private sector to provide supplemental educational services for the students. And I've been studying this since it's come out in big school districts and looking at how the market functions. And I've come to be concerned that we don't, in expanding this, it's increasingly expanding because a lot of these organizations end up getting pretty, market power in terms of providing services to students, is that we don't see that same public service motivation necessarily embodying the service delivery. Just to give you an example of looking at rates tutors were charging, up to over $150 per hour for supplemental instruction, which meant on school budgets those kids would get very little tutoring. And when we looked at this across the board, so one school district in particular said, okay, well, we're now, after they got a waiver from No Child Behind, so we're going to set a rate per hour, and they have to provide it this or less, or you can't provide. Organizations that were providing more services previously at more than 3 times that cost came down to, said, yeah, we can deliver it at that. So that's kind of, to me, a question, and how carefully do we I was curious what your perception is as we've waded into this territory. And I'm not saying that there aren't private organizations that don't have the same interests, but that we haven't been as careful about looking at the best interests of the kids as we've expanded kind of the extent of the private sector involvement in public education.
Well, I don't think there are any panaceas here in education, and I don't think, subcontracting it out to the private market is necessarily a solution. But there's some evidence here, there's some data, there's a lot of data, as you know. Rod Page, who succeeded me by 2 as Secretary of Education, or 3, when he was superintendent of schools in Houston, he said, I subcontract out 80% of the services because they do a better job. And I think he would say, this is a rough quote of him, I would rather have the private sector interested in maximizing profit do these services if their profit depends upon my kid's success than some public-spirited general feel-good thing which doesn't depend on the kid's success. Now, but there's all sorts of people in this business, and some are hustlers and some are not. I was in this business, guilty. I was the co-founder of K-12, an internet-based education program. And it's fascinating, and it was a good business, and it did well. I'm not involved in it now. But the claim for K-12, and to use the K-12 curriculum, anybody have any familiarity with K-12? Anybody? I mean, little brothers or sisters? All right. Might have partaken of it, was that it'll make you smarter, it'll make you better, you'll score better, and you'll learn your math, and it'll be infinitely patient with you. So the financial success of the company was entirely dependent upon the achievement of the students. And turned out we guessed wrong. We thought we'd have an awful lot of gifted and talented kids in the program. We had very few gifted and talented kids, but we had 40% special ed, special needs kids in the program. And it was very good for these special needs kids. And it worked very well. So God bless the company for that because it did its job. But that's what you have review for, and that's what you had accountability for. Now, we had accountability, and I think this occurs a lot in education, built into us, because a lot of people didn't like us. They didn't like the fact that we were coming on the scene, and they were saying, teachers' unions, for example, were saying they're going to take the students, and they're going to do all this online. By the way, if they were worried about K-12, they better worry about the next 5 or 10 years, because the technology, online education, MOOCs, massive open online courses, it's coming. And it'll come in the private sector, and it'll come in the public sector. When Rick Perry, I'm sure not popular here, on this issue anyway, says, why can't you get a 4-year education for $10,000 at one of my regional campuses? It's a question that can be answered, and part of the answer, I think, is that you can do it at some places using the technology. That means utilizing the private sector. But I've become, after 45 years in education, I've become pretty hard-nosed about this. I'll take pretty much anything that works that gets results for the kids. And the thing that frustrates me more and more is the amount of money we pour down a rat hole every year in the lousy schools that we don't close down. And it hurts the kids the most who need the help the most. That's why I thought that movie, Waiting for Superman, was such a great movie, such an important breakthrough.
Was the number yesterday about $12,000 per student to educate?
About $12,000 per child per year in America.
So what Rick is asking for is across the board 20% reduction in overhead, which is a pretty big stretch. Infrastructure, staffing, all the above, unless you go massively online.
It's worse than that.
More subsidized.
Scott, it's $10,000 for 4 years.
For 4 years, he wants
not 8
$10,000
years.
for 4 years.
For the whole 4.
No free lunch on stop.
And you should know that Dr. Bennett's new book is going to praise UT's Plan 2 program in particular.
Nice of you to say that. While the title is college worth it? And there's a question mark.
But we will make sure that the section on Plan 2 in UT is
Yes.
on Governor Perry's desk.
And the
Yes,
section on the LBJ program.
yes, exactly. Well, that counts, of course, yes.
Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming today.
Thank
And,
you.
I kind of want to just, like to ask a question on behalf of LBJ students and kind of going off of.
On the what?
On behalf of LBJ students, the policy students
Okay.
here. And going off of Mr. Noble's point about just the real realities of working in policy, especially politics, going into representative democracy, if we're not going to be going into public administration where we're in a civil position and we have, just to forward the organization, if we're going to be in politics,
I mean, this intersection has been in my mind the entire time I've been in policy. And I just want to know if you have any more words of practical advice. I mean, we're dealing today with campaign finance. We haven't had these issues as much before this legal precedent. And we'll have interest groups, we'll have PACs. You know, do we make up our own minds about how we want to be and then let those groups support us? I mean, do you just outright be independent of those?
You mean if you're running for something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I
What do
mean, you run
suggest to
you
people
run
today
because of
this-
who you are and what you believe and what your convictions are, and then they come to you. I'm of the Reagan view. If they support you, you don't necessarily endorse everything they do, but you're happy for their support, and you make the point when there's distance.
Do you think they can survive? Do you think we could survive doing that in
Sur-
this environment?
What survive doing?
Do you think we can survive and excel in with private interest groups? Like, do you think that that's just going to comport to our values?
I don't think that's the risk to democracy in our time. I think the risk to democracy in our time, or this democracy, is our education system. When you've got more 18 to 29-year-olds, when you've got 48% of your 18 to 29-year-olds have a more favorable view of socialism than of capitalism, you got a problem. You have a problem. I understand capitalism and its issues and its defects, but I also understand what socialism is and means, and anybody who's read history should. And that means that we're not succeeding in educating people about the nature of reality, in my view. But we're getting a lot of the politics we deserve. People on the conservative Republican side, scream about, Republicans and throw them all out and all this. And there are people on the Democrat side complaining about Obama not going far enough. This and that. American people are pretty much getting what they're willing. You don't like a Republican House and a liberal Democrat president. Stop voting them the heck in. You got what you want.
But I guess, and we were talking about this
Okay,
before.
it's a different question.
No, well, it related to this, because what I hear quite often, students coming to my office is saying they want to run for office, and I
Oh, yeah.
tell them you should run for office, because I want good people to run for office, and if they're my students, they're good people, right? So I want them to run for office, but it's really hard. And I think you laid out some of the reasons, unless you happen to have a really rich uncle who will finance your campaign. It's
Oh,
really
I got
hard.
you. I'm sorry, I missed the
You're
point.
outspent 3-1, you have a tough time.
I missed the point. I look, campaign finance. Look, I think you should be able to. I think Steve Forbes, who decided to run for president, he actually wanted to give $10 million to Jack Kemp, and not run. I think he should have been able to do that. No cash, no foreign money, but you can give as much as you want, because you got to spend all your time raising money unless you have a ton of money, and that is impossible. Because I've been with candidates. And to me, this may be the academic in me, the impatient academic. I mean, this friend of mine who later became a U.S. Senator said to the guy who was running, he said, okay, you're going to go to this fundraiser and you got to shake hands with everybody here. And when a guy says to you, he's going to write you a check for $3,000, a lot of people think 3 + 2 = 5. I think it actually equals 6. You got to say, that's a damn good point. And what? You don't have to believe it, but you have to say it if you want to get the check. And that is why that's personal. That's why I would say you're an idiot, so I wouldn't get the check. I remember going into Phil Graham's office, Phil Dagon Graham, when he decided to run for president. William, he said, I'm running for president of the United States. And I said, good for you. He said, I'd like your support. I said, well, I'll think about it. I said, when are you starting? He said, I'm starting next week. He said, I got 150 receptions in 5 weeks. I said, I thought to myself, I would rather sew my face to the floor. 100. How are you? I'm fine. Boom. My wife will tell you, I don't go to one reception a year. I took an early morning radio show at 6 in the morning, which means I have to get up at 4 so I wouldn't have to go to receptions. No, that's not why I did it. I did it because I like it. But can you imagine such a life? You know something? There are people who love it. They love it and they thrive in it, and you watch them, and you marvel at them, and you say, maybe there's a better man or woman than I would be. So, I mean, I think the campaign finance stuff is crazy.
I mean, I don't think you can afford to be moral in that environment.
I think you can afford to be moral. You just have to take people seriously. You have to listen to people. I think you can.
Brandon, you've been.
I know, I mean, the results are that people get elected who are moral, and they're financed with zillions of small contributions.
Brandon.
Thinking of the service academies and their ethical leadership model integrated into the curriculum in every facet of life there, I wonder if there is a role for formal ethics education in American education, and what's too young and what's too late?
That's a great question. I'm not really for the separate ethics course at all, because I think that suggests that ethics is over here.
Right.
And it's not part. In fact, I had this argument with the United States Naval Academy. You mentioned this. I was asked to give the Forrestal lecture one year. That was a great event, great occasion. Talk about an attentive audience, you know. Not like a bunch of unruly middle schoolers, you know. And afterwards, it was a great time. Afterwards, they came to see me and they said, you know, we love your Book of Virtues. We're thinking of setting up an Institute for Ethics at the Naval Academy. I said, what the hell are you unless you're an Institute for Ethics? The whole damn place is, isn't it? I should have said that, I guess. I said, your whole place is either a temple of ethics or you've missed the point. It's about service. It's about duty. It's about putting other people first. Over here we do ethics, and what are we doing over here? I mean, the whole thing has to be suffused. That's the point. And I think, you know, when people, H.G. Wells said, when you enter the military, you enter a higher order of being. You're now existing I'm mangling the quote. Let me go backwards. John McCain said to my son on an airplane, and my son became, our son is the United States Marine, second lieutenant. He graduated from Princeton and was commissioned an hour later, second lieutenant Marine Corps. John McCain said, if you enter that service, your life changes. You now exist for other people in a way, you know, other people don't think about. And he said that becomes part and parcel of you. So I think that ethical infusion has to be across the curriculum, if you will, at any place that calls itself a moral institution or that isn't embarrassed by the words. If you look at the charters of most of our universities, that's the language that's used.
Right.
The question is it taken seriously? I mentioned yesterday that at dinner, this guy who sued Columbia University because it said in the catalog, you know, established in, what was it, 17-something? King's College, learning, virtue, and piety. And he said, I got some learning, not a lot of virtue, and piety actually never came up during 4 years. I talked to a young woman who went to Georgetown University, and I said, why'd you choose a Catholic university? She said, it's not a Catholic university. I said, no, I mean, why'd you choose a Catholic? She wasn't being facetious or hyperbolic. She didn't realize it was Catholic. She was there 4 years. She said, you ever see a crucifix or anything? Anybody ever doing any of that stuff around? You know? She said, no, it never came up. So, you know, who are you? If you were, look, yeah, no, I know, not a 10, maybe, but a good student. But you are who you are. Say who you are. You know, a lot of these very successful colleges, these small evangelical colleges, that really mean it, and you know that they are who they are, and you should be who you are.
Simon.
Apropos of exactly what you said, there's been a lot of rhetoric, especially recently, but I think it's consistent, that schools are failing to raise ethnically minded, moral young men and women because religious practice has been excluded, in some cases very aggressively from the classroom. Do you believe that there is a disconnect between those two?
Oh, I believe that's true, because I think religion is the anchor of most people's morality, not everybody's morality. And I certainly think you can have a morality without being anchored in religion, but for most of us, that's where the anchor is. We sent our boys to Catholic schools because it was important to us that they have that. We also liked the relative freedom of the Catholic schools to be able to talk directly to boys without fear of lawsuit. And we thought our boys needed some good direct talk from time to time. It turned out fine. They were the schools kind of Catholic Spartas, reading, running, writing, playing, praying, and sending boys home tired. And they have a practice called JUG, Justice Under God, which is kind of a penalty box, which I think also makes sense. I think the moral deprivation of the schools is a real serious problem in American life, and I think it's a moral stunting. One reason that I've been a strong advocate for school choice is that I think it would help the kids who need help the most. And if you look at the decline, the collapse of the Catholic schools in the inner cities, it's a really sad thing, because the track record of the Catholic schools with poor inner city minority kids is remarkably good, and that's a bad thing to lose. Is it because of the religious instruction? I don't know if it's the specific religious instruction, but it's a moral universe, and it's self-consciously and explicitly a moral universe, and I think that helps. We were telling the story yesterday, a chilling thing I saw at an elementary school forum where a teacher said, was talking about a kid who'd had a really rough time, had been bounced around in and out of orphanages, and was back in that school, and they said, sometimes a kid just needs a good hug. And this other teacher counselor stood up and said, don't you dare hug that child. You will be sued if you hug that child. You cannot touch a child in an inappropriate way, and a hug is an inappropriate way. Well, we've litigated our way to this kind of thing, sometimes with good reasons, sometimes because there were good cases. But yes, if you're asking me, I truly do believe that we are moral and spiritual beings, and I believe what the founders believed. We are moral and spiritual beings. That moral education is part of what we should get from an early age, and it's not fancy, it's not highly academic, it's mostly habit. Aristotle says rule, precept, and example. And you give kids rules, and then later you explain to them the reasons for them. You don't have to explain to them early on because they won't get it. You don't have to worry about it now. I'll explain it to you later. And then example, and I think those are very powerful.
So we have
very powerful teachers. And they're available everywhere. You don't have to have a degree in philosophy to do it. When I was Secretary of Education, I was asked to name the most influential teacher in my career as a young person. And I had a lot of them, but I picked my coach, my football coach, my line coach, because he taught me, I didn't have the words for it then, but he taught me what I found in William James, the difference between toughness and callousness. I was a teenage boy and I thought tough meant callous. I thought tough meant macho, indifference. And he taught me that toughness meant endurance, perseverance, sticking with it, taking a beating and keep on ticking, keep on going. And I was a very slow, very bad lineman. I took a lot of beating.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and I want to let Professor Sherry Greenberg get her question on the table, and then I know Scott Noble almost jumped out of his seat a few minutes ago, so I want to make sure he can make his point as well. But Sherry, you go first. Scott will wait for you as a gentleman, and then we'll go to
I will make mine very quick, but I want to circle back to the question that was asked about campaign finance and the Citizens United case.
Yeah.
As someone who has actually run for office 5 times, it is difficult. My goal personally is I want as many people as possible running for office, and I don't care what your party affiliation or anything else is. I want more people involved. And when I was running for office, it was challenging. I didn't have then personal wealth, and there were times where I returned checks to people, okay? Because for myself, ethically, I said, look, I am opposed to what you want to do. I am not going to accept a check from you. And I return checks. But it is challenging. The person with the most money doesn't always win. You have to have enough to be competitive though. And there came a point for me where at one point people wanted me to run actually for something statewide. And I said no, because I don't have the personal wealth and I'm not willing to do what it takes to get the money to run statewide. So my question for you is this something that you would be interested in continuing a discussion on, a dialogue on how we address this.
Sure, absolutely. I'm
Thank you.
not, that well versed on it. I'm just curious, would you be for lifting limits? So you don't have to go around with the cup?
I would be willing to, yes, I tried to, when I was in the Texas legislature, work on legislation on campaign finance, and it's like the old story, the boy sticks his finger in the dike.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, because you put your finger in here and it leaks out elsewhere. So yes, I would, in conjunction with some other things, and I'd love to speak with you about it, and I cede my time to the gentleman.
And I got one more.
Who's that?
One more thing. Yeah, no, there's
Yes.
at least one gentleman here for sure. One other thing. When you gave the check back, was it because you thought you were getting it under the wrong pretext? That is, Sherry, we agree with you 100% that and you were saying that's not my view, so here's your money back, or were people saying we don't agree with you, but here's the check anyway?
I gave the check back just because I personally, in good moral conscience, could not accept campaign funds from somebody who I was gonna go out and oppose, go to the mat opposing.
Opposing their view.
Yes,
But did this person, I'm just curious what's in that person's mind, they opposed your view, but they were writing you a check anyway?
yes.
Because
and
they were hoping to have influence with you later, even if you...
There were
I see.
two instances. In one instance, it went fine. In the second instance, the person really did not take it.
Okay.
Scott?
But on that note, just knowing some big firms up in New York, they will pick out a token one or two that are gonna have one party, and they equal the money between 50 people, and they hedge their bet. They play it both ways, depending on who's gonna be the spokesman for the KKRs of the world. Big people like that, they play both sides, almost right down the middle of the politics stuff. On a comment of going back, and this has been taught by a lot of my mentors, and I've got a leadership academy for 600 kids every year. We spend 50% of the time on ethics, morals, habits, choices. Thoughts become your actions. How do you control your thoughts? Ethics is an application of your morals.
Right.
How to apply this in life to really build a track record like a company, but a track record of what you believe in. That's really what you're trying to build, is a track record of habitual steps where it becomes effortless.
Right.
Where it's not an issue to make those choices out there. I think after World War II, institutions and universities took people in kind and mentored them, and they were family. I think over time, they have become, here's 22 grand, here's your product, we'll get you through the schooling. They've had to get out of the family business for probably more tort reasons than anything, some financial. So I think now becomes this talk like today of how do we get this family business that they're not getting from single parent families back into the classrooms or in additional classes. Extremely important in a business, because there's no time off of being judged, and y'all need to know that. None. If you're taking drugs now, if I want to party later, I'm going to choose the smart person that didn't take drugs. Simple decision. No time off of being judged. You're not that guy. You're not that person. So unfortunately, those are decisions, small choices that build up to a character who you are. So you have to be so tough to be a leader at the top, on your game all the time. I'm working with my kids over that every day. They're 14 and 17 years old. After a while, it becomes effortless. But it takes a long time to get there.
Yeah, it sure does. Great statement. Can I just say last
Please,
thing, which
please.
is go into the light of public policy. It's great. I mean, the water's fine. I've been in it a long time, and I came out with philosophy degree, for Pete's sakes. And I was walking around saying, what does I mean? Who is existence? So, if I can make it, you can make it. I just had a great time. I don't think I lost my soul, sold my soul, and learned a lot, had great times, and to have the great engaged in the great public debates, the policy debates. I had a back and forth with Moynihan on the pages of the Washington Post about welfare reform in '96 and what it would mean. What an opportunity to put your learning to use in in this kind of public forum. So the water's great. Come on in. Congratulations to all of you on your work.
And I want to thank Scott Noble for making this event possible. I want to thank all of you for coming. I especially want to thank Mrs. Bennett for putting up with us the last 2 days, and Chris Beach, who is here as Bill Bennett's real power behind the throne. The man is a puppeteer, and then himself. Dr. William Bennett, it's inspiring to hear someone with strong opinions that are based on learning and based on a great deal of thought. And I think more than anything else, we're trying to model a world of politics where we debate big issues and where we challenge one another and where we make ourselves better. And I thank you for encouraging us to do that. I thank you for modeling that. And I look forward to seeing all of you do that in public office.
Yeah,
Thank you
great.
very
That's
much.
a great idea.